Chapter 13. A Matter of Trust. Time seemed to pass slowly in the cell. There was no way of knowing how much time had passed since they'd been put here. With nothing else to do except chat to the other inmates, time seemed to drag very slowly. Reyes knew whoever was in charge of the arena was going to have to feed their prisoners sometime. They would want their prisoners to put on a good show when they entered the arena to die, and that wasn't likely to happen if most of the inmates were half-starved or dying from malnutrition. "Do you miss Kagara, my chief?" Quinnigoff asked. She took a seat on the dirt of the cell floor next to him and rested her back against the bars. "I do," Reyes replied, not bothering to look at her. "But at the same time, I'm glad she isn't here." "I understand, my chief," Quinnigoff commented. "I wish I wasn't here, though my place is at your side." Reyes looked at the illuminated shadow that was Quinnigoff. He was sorely tempted to point out that the only reason they were down here in the first place was because she had killed Kagara. He resisted the urge. It wasn't going to help the situation. Looking through the bars of the cell to the rest of the under arena was no help whatsoever. Nothing seemed to be happening anywhere. There was no movement, no noise. It almost felt as if the inmates sharing Reyes' cell had all been dumped in here and forgotten about. Even with his eyesight enhanced with magic, he couldn't really see far beyond the two lit oil lanterns. Had there been one long wall opposite the cell, then Reyes was certain he would have been able to make out a little of the brickwork. But since all he could see was total darkness between the lamps, he assumed that there had to be some kind of corridor there, a corridor that led to other parts of the under arena, to other cells. Reyes imagined that corridor would be lined with cells. Some would be similar to this one, while most would be quite smaller. Those with 10 or more wings under their belt were probably kept in relatively high quality cells. Reyes imagined them being made to feel very comfortable. He imagined some prisoners having all the comforts of home. He imagined comfortable furniture, maybe a nice table and several small knickknacks that would make the place feel more like home. Reyes could even imagine that the prisoners who were really good at putting on a show for the arena would be given special dispensation. They might be allowed excursions about the city under the watchful eye of some arena guards. They might even be allowed to entertain others in their cell. It was the lack of noise that bothered Reyes the most. As he sat by the bars watching the darkness, he let his imagination run wild as to what might be happening elsewhere in the under arena. There was a lot of chatter inside the cell. The conversation seemed endless. If, as he suspected, the next cell was just a short way into that corridor between the two oil lanterns, then he was certain he should have been able to hear all sorts of noises coming from them. Even the mere act of moving about the cell should have created a fair amount of noise. But there was nothing. The entire place seemed to be cloaked in silence. Then, some time that Reyes judged to be about 2 hours after he had first settled down on the dirt floor, although he had no real way of telling, something confirmed that the darker area between the two lanterns was indeed some kind of passageway. They appeared at the far end of it, illuminated by the torch carried by one of the two armoured figures. Their footfalls made no noise of any kind as they traversed the long corridor, each step they took bringing them closer and closer to Reyes and his cellmates. As well as the two armoured figures, there was a third pushing what appeared to be some kind of trolley. They were producing so much light that when they got close enough, Reyes was able to make out many of the small details about them. For a start, their armour was very ornate, designed for appearance rather than strength. The decorations were beautiful. Gold and silver motifs covered every inch of the armour. The two armoured figures carried long elven bows in their hands and bore swords at their waists. In both cases, the soldier already had an arrow ready to fire, although neither of them had actually drawn their bowstring. None of the three were wearing any kind of helmet. The trolley that the third elf was pushing was covered by a large white linen sheet. Although the contents were hidden from view, Reyes could smell them, the unmistakable scent of many kinds of food placed together on the table to be served as if the prisoners were honoured guests. Reyes could smell meat, lots of meat. Meat to keep his strength up. His stomach grumbled at the thought of getting to eat again. Other than the quick breakfast before he had left his village, he had had nothing all day. The elf pushing the table seemed to be struggling. Clearly the table was weighed down quite a bit with many of the dishes that graced its surface, and the floor of the under arena was hardly as smooth as would be ideal. Considering how much effort the elf was putting into pushing the table, Reyes would have expected to hear the tortured screaming of the wheels, yet not a single sound reached his ears. "They make no noise," Tanegi commented, echoing Reyes' thoughts. "They don't," Quinnigoff agreed. "They don't want us talking to those in the next cell, or Maybe they don't want us to hear the fighting in the arena, because by doing so we might be able to judge how far down we are and use that information to escape. I can think of many reasons why they'd want to keep us in silence down here. Reyes didn't comment, his eyes fixed on the approaching elves. The elves with the longbows took posts directly under the lit oil lanterns. They stood to attention with a noiseless stamp of their feet. Reyes was more interested in what the third elf was doing. His actions were the focus of attention for many of the cell's inmates. After all, he had brought the food. Reyes had another reason for wanting to watch him. He had the feeling that maybe this third elf had the key to escape in this place. As soon as Reyes had seen the table, he had assumed that the elf was going to be opening the door of the cell and wheeling the table in. Reyes' main thoughts revolved around wondering how the elf was going to get himself through the magical barrier that blocked the door, and finally came to the conclusion that the elf had to be wearing something that would afford him safe passage. The two longbow-armed elves could be a problem. They were close enough for a sleep spell, and yet far enough apart that Reyes would have to move along the cell in order to put both archers to sleep. The second archer would have plenty of time to react, and at such close range, it was highly unlikely he would miss. Besides, would the spell still work beyond magical bars, and in magical silence? Reyes climbed to his feet and prepared himself. He thought about putting on his armour, even assuming his armour was still in the ring. He couldn't help but feel he was too close. At this range, even an elven archer's arrow might pierce his armour. He climbed slowly to his feet, turning fully to face the three elves on the other side of the bars. He knew he couldn't stay here. He had to escape. If an opportunity presented itself, he would put his armour on and risk it. "Be ready," he told Tanegi and Quinagoth without looking at either of them. "This might be our only chance." "Ready for what?" Tanegi replied uncertainly. Just moments later, Reyes realised that his plan wasn't going to work. The elf made no attempt to open the door to the cell. Instead, he wheeled the table until it was standing parallel to the bars of the cell. Then he removed the linen cloth, revealing all the mouth-watering delights that lay underneath. It was quite a large spread, but with more than 40 people in the cell, it wasn't going to spread very far. Reyes wasn't the only one who could see there wasn't enough food on the tables for everyone. Most of the occupants of the cell had moved slowly closer and closer to the bars as soon as all three elves had first appeared. Reyes had been so wrapped up in thinking about escape, he hadn't really noticed just how crowded this part of the cell had gotten until the elf uncovered the table. There seemed to be some kind of unwritten law governing their behaviour. Everyone was gathering just a few feet from the table, but no one was making any attempt to approach it while the elf was still there. Even having removed the linen cloth from the table, the elf hadn't finished setting it up. He pinned the table to the bars of the cell with special clasps that seemed to be attached to the side of the table. Once this was done, the elf undid a small hinge at the very end of the table, thus splitting the table in two lengthways, doubling the length of the table whilst halving the width. The wide range of delicacies that had been on the back of the table, and which might have been out of arm's reach for some of the cell's inmates, were now a lot more accessible. Another couple of clasps, and the table was locked firmly into place. Having finished his task, the elf looked up briefly. He seemed to notice the waiting inmates for the first time since he had gotten there. There seemed to be no sign of any emotion in his eyes. This was just his job. The elf turned, and with both his hands free, he indicated to the archers that they should follow. Suddenly there was chaos. As a body, everyone in the cell seemed to surge forward at the same time. Among those who got to the table first were the Minotaur and the 4 other harpies. These were creatures with the strength to back up their hunger. There weren't many elves or goblins who could be willing to try and push in front of them. Reyes couldn't help himself. Being so close to the bars already, the scent of the food got the better of him, and almost before he realised he was doing it, he reached between the bars and grabbed hold of a leg of pork. It was a nice large piece of meat, too large to fit comfortably through the bars, and those who had brought the food hadn't supplied the inmates with anything that could be used to cut the meat into smaller chunks. After only a few seconds' hesitation, Reyes dropped the leg back on the table for the next lucky diner and took hold of one end of a very tempting-looking string of sausages. Reyes stepped back from the bars, his sausages in his hand, making room so that some of the other inmates could squeeze past and grab something from the table. Reyes was also keen to get away from the crush of so many unwashed and stinking bodies. Once he was clear of the bars, he smelt his greasy hands, savouring the sweet scent of the sausages, while trying to guess at the type of meat used in their manufacture. Uncertain exactly what it was he was about to eat, he broke one of the sausages off the string and popped it into his mouth. Slowly the flavour of the sausage seemed to permeate his very being. It wasn't really lamb, pork, or beef, but by the taste of it, an amalgam made from the leftover bits of all three animals, ground together and placed in the skin for the prisoners at the arena. It was not a good quality sausage, but it was sustenance, and Reyes was feeling so hungry that anything would do. A moment later, he suddenly felt as if he had just come to his senses. He was done savouring the flavour and was about to bite into the sausage when a disturbing thought struck him. He spat out the sausage, and then gazed longingly at the rest of the string he had liberated from the table, before letting them all drop to the floor with a sigh. Reyes was hungry. He was very hungry. But however hungry he might be, he wasn't about to risk food that had been prepared for him by elves. The sausages didn't go to waste. One of the elves that hadn't been able to reach the table before it was emptied of its goodies saw the string drop from Reyes' hand, and regardless of how the elf might have once thought about harpies or sharing food with harpies, the urge to have something to eat was just too strong. "My chief, what is it?" Quinnigoff asked. There was the look of concern on her face. She had a drumstick from a goose in her hand, and by the look of it had nearly finished it. If the food was enchanted, it was already too late for at least one of his two bodyguards. "This is elven food." Reyes felt she had the right to know anyway. "It was brought to us by the elves. One undeniable thing I learned when I used to live in this city is that you should never eat anything given to you by, or prepared by, elves. Such food could be enchanted, and can enslave your mind." Quinnigoff said uncertainly while looking wildly at her drumstick. "How much do I have to eat, my chief, before it takes effect?" "One bite is enough," Reyes replied sadly. He rested a consoling hand on her shoulder. "But my chief, I feel fine," Quinnigoff countered. She glanced over at Tanegi. Tanegi was holding the remains of another part of the goose in her greasy hands. She had a very worried look on her face, and at Quinnigoff's prompting, she nodded. "You do now," Reyes said. "It really starts to take effect once you've slept for a while." There was a little bit of laughter somewhere not too far behind where Reyes was standing. Reyes felt that laughter didn't really fit the situation considering what might have just happened. He turned to face the culprit with an irritated, even slightly angry look on his face. The one doing the laughing was one of the other harpy inmates. He didn't know her name. He had the distinct impression that she was laughing at him. "Did I say something funny?" Reyes asked of her. The harpy gave him a big grin and tilted her head gently to the side. "This is the arena, sweetheart." "Yes," Reyes replied, uncertain what she was driving at. The harpy laughed again and straightened her head. "You want me to spell it out?" "Please," Reyes said impatiently. "Very well," she replied. "This is the arena. They hold prisoners here of all races, including elves. Actually, they probably have more elven prisoners than they do of any other race. This is an elven city, after all. We are all expected to fight in the arena. The harpies, the goblins, the minotaur, even the elves. Elves aren't affected by enchanted food in the same way as the rest of us. Do you understand what I'm saying?" Reyes hesitated for a moment while he thought about it. "You're saying that the food isn't enchanted because if it was, it would unbalance the games." It was Quinnigoff who spoke. She actually sounded quite relieved. "More than just unbalanced," the harpy commented. "Imagine you're going into the arena against an elf. Suddenly the elf shouts something at you. It's an order to drop your weapon and stand absolutely still so that she can just walk up to you and stab you with her blade. Even if she didn't give such an order, the enchanted food would make it virtually impossible for you to try and kill her." Reyes still felt uncertain. He had been indoctrinated ever since he had first arrived in this city, well over a year ago, to never trust elven food. He had passed that warning on to his sister, and if what he had heard was true, it had saved her life. It was hard to suddenly ignore such advice and decide that it was now safe to tuck in. "I've been here for 3 days now," the harpy commented. "I'm showing no ill effects. I still hate the elves for what they've done to me." Whatever claims that harpy made, Reyes couldn't help but have doubts. Then again, if he couldn't find a way out of his cell soon, he was going to have to eat something eventually or he'd begin to starve to death. "Looks like you're too late to get anything from the table now," the harpy commented. Reyes looked at the table and saw it had already been cleared. Even that leg of pork had gone. Someone must have managed to get it through the bars. He would have to wait until dinner was brought, and then maybe he would think about risking something. "There are still a few people eating," Tanegi commented. "I'm sure I could find you something." "Don't," Reyes ordered. "I'll wait." The harpy nodded, grinning. "Make sure you do get something to eat tonight. It might be your last ever meal, unless I've miscounted. We're due to enter the arena tomorrow. Tomorrow? Reyes asked. Are you sure? I can't be sure, no, the harpy replied. There's no way to tell the time down here. I think it's probably about midday because they just brought us food, but it could be the middle of the night and we'd be none the wiser. However, there are more than 40 of us in this cell. That's a week's worth of inmates. That suggests to me that we'll be fighting very soon, either tomorrow or the day after. Somehow it seems so soon. Yet perhaps it was better to get out into the arena sooner rather than later. Mangloss needed that canvas, and there was no obvious way to escape from this cell. Maybe the arena would be different. When most people were out there trying to stay alive, an opportunity might present itself. Reyes looked about the other prisoners being held inside the cell. He was certain that one-on-one, he could handle any of the other inmates in the cell, even the Minotaur if it came to it. Then he looked at his two bodyguards and hoped he wouldn't be matched against them. He felt he needed to get as much information as he could. I take it you've seen a few of these fights? A few, the harpy replied. They usually hold them early in the morning before the sun has really had a chance to get high in the sky. They like to have these newbie bouts before breakfast, because then they only need to feed the survivors. There isn't usually a very big crowd. Those who get up early in the morning tend to do so because they have to. Such people don't want to waste their time watching battles being fought at the arena. What can you tell me about the fights themselves? Reyes asked. The harpy glanced over her shoulder. Her three friends were hovering nearby, clearly listening but not joining in. Reyes saw her wings move irritably. It depends on their mood. I once saw them let everyone into the arena at once to fight it out in a free-for-all. On that occasion, the prisoners formed themselves into small factions and concentrated on the weaker groups. To be fair, it wasn't very entertaining. No, it's more likely they'll separate us into specific factions before the bout begins. That way we'll all know whose side we're on, and the audience will be entertained by a proper mock battle, rather than a series of executions. I assume they'll make us wear a uniform, Reyes asked. Reyes often had trouble telling two different harpies apart because of his human upbringing. He was certain it would prove worse for the elves. No, the harpy replied. They'll give you a piece of cloth that you wear on your arm. You mean an armband? Reyes commented. No, she replied. Well, yes, but it'll be a thin piece of cloth. I see, Reyes commented. Thank you. I assume we don't get to choose our sides. He glanced quickly towards Quinnigoth and Tenegi. He didn't want to fight either of them. He might not have known them very long, but he already thought of them as friends. The harpy shook her head sadly. She could guess by his attitude what was concerning him. There were no friends in the arena. You fight or you die. If they divide us into just two sides, they'll want to divide the races up as evenly as they can into the two factions. With only 7 harpies in the cell, it's unlikely that both of your friends will get to be in the same faction as you. It's very possible that of the 3 of you, you'll have to fight them both. Reyes sighed. I don't want to have to fight them. I'd kill myself rather than have to fight my own chief, Quinnigoth voiced suddenly. Spoken like a true bodyguard, the harpy replied. I have to admit, I like you. I take no pleasure in knowing that I might have to fight any of you. Reyes considered his options. There would be 40 or more heavily armoured and maybe armoured prisoners sent into the arena to fight at the same time. Thinking about it, that was quite a considerable number. He was certain that even if he should survive the battle, he wouldn't get another opportunity like the one that presented itself to him now. If he could somehow organise everyone in the cell into some kind of fighting force, then maybe they could fight their way out of captivity. Reyes tried to remember the time he had visited the arena with Gagara. The sky was open to the elements. There had been no magical blue glimmer, no sign of a force field preventing a harpy from taking wing and flying free. No, that was what the wing irons were for. Reyes wished he could examine a set of those irons. He wanted to know what sort of lot they had. He was certain that his magic could unlock them, but it would be nice to be sure before he started to make any wild claims. The first step, before he did anything else, was to try and organise those in the cell into some kind of makeshift army. He looked up at the ceiling for a moment, hoping that no one was using magic to spy on the inmates. Then he walked slowly towards the centre of the cell. There was a brief moment of confusion, when a harpy seemed to suddenly appear in the cell right in front of where Reyes was headed. The harpy gazed hatefully at him. Her claws were covered with blood and extended threateningly towards him. Who are you? Where am I? Slowly she began to realise what had happened. She gave Reyes an accusatory look, then lowered her half-risen hand and stepped out of his way. Reyes gave her a little bit of room, stepping around the newly arrived inmate. Then he faced towards the bars and began to address the inmates of the cell. "Ladies and gentlemen of all races, if I may have your attention, please." Reyes looked briefly at Tanegi and Quinagoff. Neither of them spoke Elistran, so they wouldn't be able to understand a word he was saying. He would have to tell the two of them what was happening later, assuming he got the cooperation, he thought. "What do you want, harpy?" someone shouted angrily. "Some of us are going to die soon," another called. "The last thing we want to hear is your ugly voice." There were also quite a number of catcalls from various parts of the cell, along with several boos and hisses. It seemed that regardless of what Reyes might have to say, few were willing to take him seriously. Reyes decided to push ahead anyway. Surely someone in the cell would see how reasonable his suggestion was. If he could convince just one elf, maybe that elf would be able to convince the others. Soon we would be sent out into the arena to fight for our lives. "So what?" someone shouted. "We know this," another offered. "Shut up," this came from yet another. The booing and hissing continued, but Reyes did his best to ignore them. "They aren't going to be forcing us to fight with our bare hands. They will be arming us. They'll be giving us swords, axes, maybe even a few bows." "No bows." This was from the harpy Reyes had been speaking to a few minutes earlier. "And they won't let us have bows except for very special circumstances." "What's your point?" one of the other inmates, an elf, shouted amid all the catcalls. "My point," Reyes said, turning towards the voice, and even taking a single step towards the speaker, "is that there will be more than 40 armed men and women in the arena. They expect us to fight each other to the death, but I've seen their guards. I've seen how poorly equipped they are. Those guards are there for display only. I'm sure that if we wanted to, we could fight our way to freedom." Somewhere, someone started to laugh. "They'd slaughter us," someone commented after a couple of seconds. Reyes had a feeling it was one of the harpies, but he wasn't certain. "They'll have guards posted on high platforms all around the arena, 6 of them, 2 hours per platform, and they will have bows." Then another added, "The only way out of the arena is back into the under arena. Unless you somehow have access to a teleport spell, how would we get out?" Reyes rounded on the others in the cell. He ignored the jeering and spoke as clearly as he could. "It's true. I doubt all of us will get out alive, but I would rather die trying to escape than to spend the next 20 years waiting to face someone in the arena who could prove to be a better fighter than me. There will be more than 40 of us. Now that's quite a formidable force. Including myself, there are now 8 harpies in this cell. Harpies can fly. It will only take 6 of us to neutralise those platforms. We'll be wearing wing irons to stop us from flying." Clearly this comment had come from one of the other harpies. "What if I was to tell you I could remove those wing irons with barely a moment's thought?" Reyes asked. Even as he spoke, he hoped he was right about that. "I'd assume you were lying," the harpy countered. "That's the thing," one of the elves said. "You're a harpy. You're hardly the most trustworthy of races." "No one trusts a harpy," someone called. "Even other harpies don't trust harpies." Reyes sighed. It was no good. He walked slowly back across the cell to where Tanegi and Quinagoff were standing waiting for him. "What was all that about, my chief?" Quinagoff asked him as he reached her. "I was trying to offer up a plan of escape," Reyes explained. "Doesn't sound as if they were willing to listen," Tanegi offered. "They weren't," Reyes replied. But it seemed as if his words hadn't fallen totally on deaf ears. The harpy Reyes had been speaking to earlier approached him and asked, "Do you really think you'll be able to remove your wing irons?" Reyes looked at her and smiled. "I guarantee I'll be able to remove my wing irons. I'm not so certain about anyone else's, but I'm willing to try." Quinagoff laughed at the newly arrived harpy. "Of course she'll be able to remove your wing irons. She has no small skill with magic. A quick twist of her wrist, and your wing irons will fall into the sand of the arena like the trash they are." Reyes looked worriedly up at the ceiling of the cell, hoping beyond hope that no one was listening in and had heard that comment. "In our village," Quinagoff continued, "our people are convinced that she is Lammerwalt reborn." "Please," Reyes protested. "Lammerwalt?" the harpy commented, her eyes wide in wonderment. Reyes shrugged his shoulders. Normally he'd be trying to deny the comment. It wasn't in his nature to impersonate a deity, even a harpy deity. On this occasion, though, he didn't think it could hurt if it might give him a little bit of support for his escape plan. "I assume you can prove this," the harpy added. Reyes glanced worriedly about him. Talking about magic was one thing, but actually performing it before he got out into the arena might tip his hand and enable the organisers to take certain countermeasures. Eventually, Reyes turned his attention back to the harpy in front of him. It's dark in here. It is, the harpy agreed uncertainly. How would you like to see a little better? Reyes asked. What do you mean? The harpy asked suspiciously. Reyes gathered a little bit of energy into himself and then he touched the harpy gently on the side of her temple. The harpy moved her hand as if to block what she first perceived as an attack, but then she paused. It was as if she was seeing the cell for the first time. She was looking about herself, amazed. What did you do? I enabled your eyes to make better use of the light available. You should be able to see much better while you're in the dark, but it's only good for about an hour. Come back when it wears off and I'll recast it. You do know magic, the harpy exclaimed. She knelt down in the dirt in front of Reyes. Forgive me for doubting you, my goddess. Forgive me for even thinking you might have been male. I am whatever I need to be, Reyes replied calmly. He rested a hand on the harpy's shoulder and told her, Please stand up. I do not like being idolized in such a way. Besides, I need your help. You need my help? The harpy sounded a little incredulous. I need you to spread the word to all the harpies in the cell, and to anyone else that will listen. Tell them that regardless of what colour armband we are forced to wear when we are sent into the arena, that we will work together to escape from this place. The more of us there are, the better our chances. Is this a test, my goddess? The harpy asked. They won't believe me. Then bring them to me, Reyes replied. I shall convince them the same way I did you.